Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Today, we have a special guest. Very pleased to announce that Tom Joscelyn is back to discuss one of our least favorite subjects on the planet, Afghanistan. Tom is a senior fellow at Just Security and an OG at the Long War Journal. Tom, welcome back to Generation Jihad. Great to have you.
Bill, thanks for having me. It's always great to be on here with you and to go through these quasi-therapy sessions.
Exactly. It's sad that everyone has to listen to it, but here we are. They seem interested some way. Anyway, today we're going to discuss Afghanistan and perhaps our least favorite actor who's involved in Afghanistan, in the Afghanistan debacle outside of those of the Taliban terror realm. And that would be Zalmay Khalilzad, the former special representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation and the key architect of the Doha Agreement, which aided the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan. On November 8th of 2023, Khalilzad was interviewed by the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, and the transcript of that interview was released on May 1st of this year. A lot of things in that interview. I believe he was interviewed for 9 to 10 hours. It's a hefty read. I did a quick write-up of one of his claims that Al Qaeda doesn't exist anymore. That's in quotes. And aside from that, he also claimed Al Qaeda was dismantled. That's hilarious.
There you go, Bill. You got another D word for your list.
That's right, man. We got it. It decimated, defeated, degraded, diminished, destroyed, declined, and dead. Now we got. What did he say again? I'm getting confused. Dismantled. Yeah. I can't believe it took that long.
I know. I mean, it's got to be other. I mean, you got to be able to use the source on Google and come up with other D words that fit. I mean, there's got to be other ones. There could be endless iteration of this. So
I wonder if they do that too, right? They're like, yeah, man, Bill loves the D words, so let's just, let's get in there.
Or it's like, how do we sell a line of bullshit with a slightly different word? Because that's basically, So.
But there's some kind of odd focus on the D, Tom. It's just I don't know. I don't believe in coincidence at that point when we have 8 to 10 D words. I think someone also said done. I might have missed that one. There's probably other D words that we missed.
Sure.
Yeah. Anyway, so the funny part about that, Tom, and I think you caught this, is that his answer that Khalilzad gave was a question that was posed to him in an article that we wrote at the Long War Journal.
I think he's big fans based on his answer.
Yeah, he actually says in there, I know what those guys are going to say.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing, but he pretty much said that. So, Zal, if you're listening, hey, I hope you're well.
We love you too. And here's the difference is that we deal with facts and logic, whereas your entire mission was based on a completely illogical premise, which we're going to talk about here at length. I just want to say something before we start, ripping.
Yeah, go for it, Tom.
I mean, look, the number one thing I would say right from the outset, and I do credit this part of his testimony, is that he was operating, and I credit it because I know it firsthand from conversations with people in the Trump administration. You remember he's appointed in September of 2018, and he explains that by August 2018, the decision had been made to withdraw from Afghanistan. That was what was been decided. We got to get out, and everything else was basically window dressing around that decision. And I know that's true because I reported it at the time in October 2018. I wrote an article titled "The War in Afghanistan is Over. We Lost," which said that right when Zal is stepping back onto the stage, Zalmay Khalilzad is stepping back on the stage and taking over this position. The Khalilzad's role is really, whether he knows it or not, to facilitate this loss, And you can go back to the article, you can Google it. I stand by it to this day because I think it proved completely correct, just as everything you and I were reporting at the time proved correct about what was actually going on. And so the bottom line is that everything that he did and everything he argues in this transcript, that takes place in the context of a decision by the commander-in-chief. And the bottom line when it comes to the war in Afghanistan is you had 3 commanders-in-chief in a row who did not want to be in Afghanistan, right? So all the decisions that are made, I think there's a lot of criticism has to be made of military leadership, diplomatic leadership, and others. I think that's all germane, should be explored at greater length. But the bottom line is it's all taking place in the context of decisions made in the Oval Office, and everybody has to remember that. And just as Trump, wanted desperately to get out of Afghanistan and probably should have gotten out earlier, if you go back to what I was writing at the time, arguing at the time, what we were talking about at the time, Biden just wanted out. We now know from her report that he can't even spell Afghanistan, despite decades of debating on this issue. And he wanted out, and to be clear, President Biden owns the final act of disastrous withdrawal for sure. But the bottom line is that Zalmay Khalilzad is a creature of these decisions that are being made, in the Oval Office. And so now we can commence with our evisceration.
Yeah, Tom. I mean, it's very clear from his. I guess this is testimony, right? It's a question and answer. It's testimony to Congress, and I believe it is sworn statement. He's very clear that his goal is to get an agreement to leave Afghanistan. But what's kind of funny here about this is what he sacrifices in order to get that agreement.
Well, this is the way I would put it, Bill, is this way. He becomes complicit in the lie, right? He starts selling the lie. I mean, the bottom line is in 2018, if you asked Bill, Raggio, or myself, you came to us and said, okay, Trump wants out. What do we do? Then you get out, right? You negotiate with the Afghan government what the terms are of getting out, what assistance you're going to provide them as you leave, and you get out. And the Taliban, that you don't need to dress this up, right? There doesn't need to be meetings in Doha. There doesn't need to be all sorts of phony counterterrorism assurances and all sorts of other nonsense. The Taliban wants us out, wants the U.S. out. That's all they've ever really wanted, right? And they would have, agreed to that. The agreement would have been 1 day, 1 minute. Hey, we want to leave. Don't attack us because you're going to force us to stay and counterattack, and just let us leave. And they'd say, okay, bye. And that's it. That's the end of Zalmay Khalilzad's career as special representative for Afghan reconciliation. I laugh when you use that title because even that title is a lie, right? There's no Afghan reconciliation.
There was no reconciliation.
Right. Yeah. No, it was all nonsense, right? So, you could just been special representative for we're out, and that's it.
Tom, I would say special representative to get the fuck out of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
That's really what his title should have been.
And that would have been it. Yeah. And that is the core truth of his testimony. That's the core truth of what his mission was. I do credit him when he talks about that. I think that's right. That was what, they didn't really care about the rest of this. In the Trump administration, he calls it management. I think that's true. But here's the problem. He then becomes complicit in selling the nonsense, right? And dressing this up to be something it isn't. And so therefore, it becomes something quite different altogether. And now I would say commence with the evisceration.
Yeah, no. Listen, this was all like some big, elaborate, extended piece of performance art that was unnecessary. As you said it, Tom, and it's funny. Zal says this in his testimony. Well, we needed agreement to get an assurance from the Taliban that they wouldn't attack us when we leave. That's why we couldn't just pick up and leave. But that's all you needed. The Taliban would have granted that in a second. They didn't. None of the, anything on women's rights, which never came to pass. Agreement with Al Qaeda about Al Qaeda's presence and whether it's conducting. None of that was needed for the U.S. to just get the hell out of Afghanistan.
Or the fictional intra-Afghan talks,
right.
Where they weren't going to talk to the Afghan government. They weren't going to share power. I mean, he could still see in his transcript, he still holds out that delusion oddly, at various points. But, none of that was necessary. The bottom line is they wanted us out. They wanted the U.S. out. They wanted the Western forces out. They would have gladly accepted any agreement that says, hey, we're not going to attack you as you're leaving. Just get out. And, quite frankly, if the U.S. had done that, it probably would have evaded the chaotic withdrawal in Kabul and the awful, disastrous, attack that happened at the airport there and the deaths of 13 Americans. I mean, it just to my mind, if you had left when actually the decision makers had decided it was time to go, or at least closer to that time, instead of stringing it out with all this other nonsense, I think it probably would have been a cleaner exit. But bottom line is that Biden owns that final withdrawal and didn't do anything to figure out a better way out.
Yeah, they picked the time when the Taliban was at its peak strength. The Obama administration wanted out it went down this path to try to get a negotiated settlement. It recognized it wasn't going to get it, so it kicked the can down to the Trump administration. The Trump administration wanted the same deal that oddly enough, the Obama administration wouldn't take. For all my criticism of President Obama's policy in Afghanistan, at least saw through what Trump and Biden, thought was a decent deal, or at least a deal that was worth pursuing. It's so perplexing. And Tom, you said it perfectly at the beginning. Window dressing. That's exactly what Doha was. It was window dressing to get the hell out of Afghanistan.
And unfortunately, it becomes, this is what you and I were criticizing them accurately at the time about. The window dressing actually becomes real from the Taliban's perspective, because what ends up happening is the U.S. ends up diplomatically siding with the Taliban against the Afghan government and throws the Afghan government under the bus. And so that starts in motion the whole process for the Afghan government collapsing even faster, as opposed to, because the Taliban believes rightly that they've achieved victory and that, the Afghan government's been cut out of the talks entirely. And so therefore they no longer have any legitimacy or standing as an actor. And you can see all this reporting about how these Afghan commanders on the Afghan government side start to fold up shop, right? Because they know that the jig is up, after all this. So, that's all that, again, it's unnecessary, right? You didn't need to. The Afghan government, may very well and probably would have been toppled anyway, but to let them fight on their own terms, get out, let them scramble to see if they can find a real leader, otherwise, other than Ghani, who is not a real leader. Let them see if they can scramble to find somebody, see if they can reorder their order of battle, figure out a way to keep fighting. They would have had 2 to 3 years to do that compared to what actually unfolded. Instead, the U.S. policy led by Zalmay Khalilzad in diplomacy effectively held the Afghan government in place, making them fight for a draw while the Taliban and, yes, Khalilzad, Al-Qaeda, were fighting for victory, right? So this is why this diplomacy becomes even worse than window dressing, because at that point now what happens is the Afghan government is fighting for this fictional draw that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have no, absolutely zero interest in.
Yeah, it delegitimized the Afghan government, freed 5,000 Taliban prisoners that were put back in, and it was all done at a point in time when the Taliban was increasing in strength. At least you could say, again, if it was done during the Obama administration, that probably would have been the best point to do it. President Obama wasn't going to do it. President Trump, if he wanted out, even in 2017, 18, the Taliban was nowhere near at its strength. And a lot of that strength that, as you noted, Tom, was granted to the Taliban by cutting this deal and by delegitimizing the Afghan government. But Leah, let's get to it. Let's first his claim about Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I'm going to quote him directly. And again, this was in response to being questioned on an article that we wrote at the Lone War Journal. And he says, quote, "I have to say for the record, looking back, that Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent has been dismantled. It doesn't exist anymore, according to our intelligence, since the Taliban took over," end quote.
Is that because they're just formally merged into the Taliban? I mean, there may be some sleight of hand here, right? Because they're just part of the Taliban government now, right? I mean, the bottom line is the AQIS, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, was always going to have its share of the Taliban's emirate. So maybe it functionally doesn't act as a separate actor anymore because it simply got its seat at the table inside the emirate, But so,
Tom,
anyway, that's totally dishonest to say that, what he's saying.
And Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent isn't just Afghanistan. It's Pakistan. It's in Central Asia.
I think he's talking about Afghanistan, right? Doesn't he?
Yeah, and I guess he isn't saying Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent in Afghanistan. No, but obviously that is the context of what he's saying. Now, let's contrast that with United Nations Security Council's analytical support and monitoring team.
Literally, I don't think when we were preparing for this podcast, I went around. I just want to say, is anybody else saying that? Right? Is anybody like the State Department, Defense Department? Now, we have many problems with their assessments through the years, right? State Department, UN. Anybody else come to the conclusion that AQIS folded up tent and doesn't exist anymore? Right? No, of course not. And it's ludicrous. But go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and he somehow knows, and he somehow is in the head of intelligence operatives or intelligence officials after he's been out of government for, I don't know, 1 to 2 years now. Again, now you and I aren't, but we primarily look at open source reporting. We do talk to individuals. and we use our brains as well. And the United Nations, we'll call it the monitoring team. Okay, so its last two reports, when you combine them together, Al Qaeda is operating training camps in 10 provinces. And
And which I would bet you anything that their reporting, as you've reported, is entirely consistent with your assessments, your analysis through the years of the Long War Journal that says that this is where they historically have been operating, and it's been a continuous, unbroken record of operations in these provinces throughout the entire period. So there's a whole well of supporting evidence that says, yeah, this makes sense in the context of everything we know about Afghanistan and the war there and how Al Qaeda operates there. It's not something that's new or surprising to us.
Yeah, it passes the smell test. And Tom, I would even argue it's probably underestimating. And here's why I say this. There's three provinces that the UN is saying Al Qaeda is not providing information for Al Qaeda being operating in. That's Paktika, and Khost. And as we
know they're there. That's
exactly, Tom. Right? These are Haqqani network strongholds where Al Qaeda has traditionally
talking about the birthplaces of Al Qaeda. You're talking about places where their first camps ever were.
And we know they were operating camps even up to the time of withdrawal. So that's not a knock on the UN report. They're going off of their information. So, I could confidently say they're operating in at least 13 provinces. By the way, I look at some of these provinces and they're probably operating here and here and here as well. Fine, I'll take the baseline. 10 provinces. That isn't 10 training camps. They're operating in 10 provinces, probably 13. There's probably more. Now, keep in mind, some of these camps are transitory. Fair enough. But
they've got some good monkey bar operations going on. I bet I wonder, the gymnast that they probably set up now probably dwarfs what they had in the 90s. Remember back to the old Al Qaeda tapes, come out.
More Rings of Fire.
Rings of Fire. Yeah, they've probably gotten much more elaborate since then, I'd kind of like to see that. Give me some popcorn. I'd like to see exactly what they're doing now. These,
one thing, Tom, people laugh at that, right? And it is humorous, right? But, one of the things documenting the Taliban training camps that I did as the Taliban tried to take over the country, I was dismissed by people in U.S. military and some intelligence. They would say, "Oh yeah, that's Mickey Mouse. That's not real training." And my argument was, they're not doing this to beat us. They're doing this to beat the Afghans. And guess what? Their training camps were Afghan good enough, and their training camps were good enough to fly airplanes into the World Trade Center and one into the Pentagon. And so their training has been good enough to train operatives to take over territory in Iraq and Syria and Somalia and Yemen, Mali and Niger. What we could go down the list, right, Tom? So
yeah, what they weren't telling you, Bill, when they were saying they're Mickey Mouse, what they weren't telling you was it was like the South Park version of Mickey Mouse. The evil mastermind version of Mickey Mouse.
Exactly.
That's what they weren't telling you. So, and yeah, there's just the problem. Anybody who sort of appeals to authority here, which is what you see in this transcript from Khalilzad, automatically that they're playing a game, right? Because the authorities have been wrong. The appeal to authority, the official estimates have been wrong over and over and over again, from the U.S. government, right? Now, you could compare what the UN has reported to what we know from other sources, and there's problems with it, sure, right? And there's mistakes, there's errors, definitely. But overall, it's a much more accurate picture than what you got from a lot of U.S. intel sources as Afghanistan was falling, right? There are places to go where you can match up what an authority is saying with the actual evidence. The problem with the U.S. assessments, which Khalilzad likes to fall back on here, including classified ones, which conveniently nobody can read outside of him and a few others, right, is that these assessments we know now were wrong, right? And I'll give you one, Bill. This is the thing to me. This is why this is the moment in the transcript where you'd say what anybody should say who's reading this should say, why should I believe anything you have to say after this? Or why should I believe that any estimate you come up with makes any sense, right? He's asked about what he thought was going to happen with the Afghan government and going forward.
Oh, this is one of my faves. I know what you're going to say. Go ahead, Tom.
And he says the dominant assumption that was, I think, in the government, based on assessments that were being made, was that the government won't collapse that quickly. And he goes on to say that it was his own assessment, his own personal judgment. And this is his own personal judgment now. He said maybe 2 years or more that there was a lot of time. He says we would have a lot of time, maybe 2 years or more, to have negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban. That is called a game ender, right? I mean, do not pass go, do not collect $200, game over, right? The reality was that this thing was folding as you were reporting in the Long War Journal, and I was reporting at the time, was folding up pretty quickly, right? That the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and their allies were carving out territory very quickly over the months preceding the actual fall of Kabul. And yet here, Special Representative Khalilzad and others were oblivious to what was the reality on the ground and what was going on. And so any assessment, if you really believe that they had 2 years or more, and he was just in error in that regard, well, that's the type of error that's a game ender, right? It doesn't matter. I don't care what you say next, right? You do not have any kind of superior judgment about what was going on here because you could not have been more wrong. And so there's nothing to fall back on at that point.
Yeah, Tom, and by the way, that was the official government estimate as well, 2+ years. Then as things started getting a little bad, well, maybe 1 year. Tom, I know you felt the same. I said publicly, it was in either TV or radio interview in April, right after the deal was announced. And I said, the Afghan government will be lucky to get out make it out past the end of the summer. And, I overestimated them. It was 5 weeks short. It fell April 15th.
No, I think you were exactly right. You would be lucky to make it out of the summer means you don't think they're going to make it out of the summer, and they didn't make it out of the summer.
Yeah, that's true. You're right. Maybe it's
I mean, look, all the way back in 2018, we were saying it's over, right? I said the war is over. We lost. So
my point being, Tom, we could feel it, right? Like we knew that this would not be something 2+ years.
Well, it was a feeling though that was based on the data, the actual evidence, right? What was actually going on? You see these gains on the battlefield in district after district after district, across the country, and you see them closing in on Kabul. You see what's going on, and there's sort of this, stick your fingers in your ears perspective from these U.S. government assessments. But the bottom line is whether we know Zal is saying he believed this too. These were the dominant assumptions, and he believed them too. That makes the whole project then right from square one means you didn't know what was going on, right? And so no assessment that's coming out of that realm, right, carries weight. You can't appeal to that authority anymore on anything, right? Because you just didn't know anything.
And yet Zal throughout, at the beginning, they ask about his credentials, and he essentially sells himself as the magic Afghan, right? Because he's from Afghanistan, gotten U.S. citizenship, but he knows everyone and he knows who to talk to and all the relationships. And yet he couldn't see this. And yet he didn't realize the Taliban never had any intention of negotiating. He's actually asked in another article that I wrote back in 2016 when the Taliban came out and said they weren't willing to share power with the Afghans, or all the sacrifices they made for a silly ministerial post. He's actually questioned on that, and he said, "Yeah, maybe that was their hopes and desires, but they probably came to some realization they couldn't win." He got so much wrong for someone in his position.
Well, I would say he and all the people around him, right, and all the people who were implicit in this magical thinking, I mean, it was all wish casting, and the thing is, he's not alone here. I mean, I don't trust him at all, obviously, because we were saying at the time you're wrong, and he was proven to be wrong, and yet there's really no sort of recognition of that on his part. But he's not alone. I mean, there were a lot of people in the U.S. government who were going along with this nonsense, and as we've lamented on this podcast many times in the past, there won't be any accountability for any of them. I mean, heck, there was a Politico article not too long ago about Khalilzad worrying about his legacy and hoping it lives up to Henry Kissinger. And I thought, boy, that's messed up all the ways around, right? Like every part of that equation is totally messed up, right? His legacy is this disaster, diplomatic disaster in Afghanistan, and Henry Kissinger's legacy ain't that great, folks. If you actually get into the specifics, selling out America to China is not really a feather in your cap, as far as I'm concerned. So the whole idea that this is all the context this is taking place in, right, where there's no real accountability, no real measurement for getting things right or or versus wrong. And you see that in diplomatic circles and in military circles.
Yeah, well, Tom, these are the same diplomatic circles, particularly that, worship Richard Nixon. And, you and I could do a whole podcast on his failures, and he's still held up to be, one of the greatest diplomats of all time. But I'll let
Bill,
that one pass.
if you think I'm harsh on any of these people,
I know.
You should. I could do a whole multi-part series on Henry Kissinger.
Listen, but listeners, but Tom has to do it in Richard or in Henry Kissinger's voice. It's really funny. One day I'll make him do it for you. Yeah, Tom. And here's a certain aspect to this. If Khalilzad just screwed up Afghanistan and walked away, I could at least, go, all right, the guy, he walked, but he hasn't. He's kept telling us that the Doha Agreement has been a success, that we should keep trying to implement it. I'll quote a tweet from him, September 14th, 2022, quote, below are two articles indicating the Taliban are delivering on their commitment to the Doha Agreement to fight ISIS and prevent al-Qaeda from using Afghan soil to threaten the security of the U.S. and our allies. This is positive. We must remain vigilant against terror. He's still selling the Doha Agreement to this day. He's still trying to sell us a bad bill of goods. And that's what's really galling in all of this. One of the things that's really galling.
Totally complicit in the whole nonsense. I mean, it's so when you quote that, you said it tweets from September 2022, right?
23.
23.
It's less than half a year ago.
2023. Okay. Well, I mean, here's why that's always been nonsense. The Taliban has always fought ISIS, and ISIS has always fought Taliban because they're jihadi rivals. They hate each other. It has nothing to do with the Doha Agreement. Zero. Right? It has to do with the fact that they can't stand each other. The issue always was the Taliban going to turn on al-Qaeda as Zal and others and Secretary Pompeo, who hired him, and others, as promised. Was that going to happen? No. Right? And so here's the thing. To sell the Doha Agreement in September of 2023, after the U.S. had to use a drone strike to kill Ayman al-Zawahiri in his victory villa in the middle of Kabul, right? In July of 2022. So, more than a year before this tweet, 14 months before this tweet is absurd, right? Because that's the whole point, is that the Taliban did not actually live up to the heart of the counterterrorism assurances that Zal and Khalilzad and others have tried to sell us on so many times. And so he's asked about that in the transcript, right? He's asked about Zawahiri being killed by a drone. And the questioner says he was found in that Zawahiri was found in a Haqqani safe house in Kabul. And Khalilzad responds, yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And he's asked, what are your thoughts about that? And he goes, a violation, full and complete. Right. And then he said, that's all I can say in this setting. Let me tell you something, bud. This is where you don't need to go hide behind any classified wall.
That is galling, Tom. Right. I am tired of that one.
Nonsense.
Tell us about it. Let's go here. Al-Qaeda's dismantled in Afghanistan. Let's put it out to light now. Fine.
Right. Their global emir is just killed in his victory villa, in the middle of Kabul. And you're going to talk about how, and he, to his credit, he admits that it's a violation, full and complete, because duh. I mean, obviously it's a violation of the counterterrorism assurances that you, Khalilzad, were selling the American people on, along with Secretary Pompeo. But we don't need any classified assessment of that, right? I don't need you to hide behind some kabuki theater that's explained to me how this really means something other than what it means, right? I mean, don't sell me on that. We know the reason why he's found in a Haqqani safe house, because the Haqqanis are an integral part of the Taliban. They can't be separated. You flogged that very early on, Bill, at Long War Journal. That was one of the many nonsense assumptions that was floated by the military early on. Well, the Haqqanis, you have to think of them as separate from the Taliban.
They're pragmatic. They're just gangsters. Remember that one from, was it Michael Flynn? And there was a British general.
Yeah, I mean, that was just totally garbage and totally wrong for so many reasons. But and to be found in a Haqqani safe house, but there's another aspect of this which I found kind of amusing, which he wasn't asked about in the transcript, Bill, which is that in his own telling, Khalilzad says that he received a letter, although it may not be authentic, but he received a letter from which does something right there. But he received a letter from Mullah Yaqub, right? Now, we know who Mullah Yaqub is, current, high-level defense minister in the Taliban's emirate, son of Mullah Omar, the founder and chief of the Taliban. And the letter supposedly says to Khalilzad that there was, this is the way Khalilzad summarized it, there was no military solution to what was going on, and they're interested for a way out. Well, first of all, this sounds an awful lot like the nonsense that the U.S. military and diplomats on the U.S. side were peddling, right? Because how many times do we hear them say there's no military solution? And by the way, the Taliban did have a military solution. They won the war, right? So to cite this in any way as germane or indicative of anything other than your own cluelessness is really something. But to complete the circle on this, the killing of Zawahiri in Kabul, there's good reporting that the two people who knew about Zawahiri's safe house in the senior most Taliban ranks that were most important in knowing about it were Siraj Haqqani, which we would expect because he and his family had protected senior Al Qaeda leaders for so many years, decades really, and number two, Mullah Yaqub, the guy who supposedly sent this letter to Khalilzad. So, I mean, this whole thing is just so, you want a classified assessment? Give me one on that one, right? Give me one on who exactly knew where Zawahiri was there and the security around and everything else. Go fetch that one for me. Instead of trying to tell me that there's something really behind this classified wall when it comes to counterterrorism assurances that are worth anything more than the paper they're written on. Because, in fact, that paper would be more worthwhile and have more value if you hadn't written on it at all, right? So,
yeah, exactly. Yaqub is also deputy emir, of course. So you have both deputy emirs of the Taliban, and as well as their interior and their defense minister. Their dual roles. Knows Zawahiri's presence. Remember, everyone at the beginning, because he was at a Haqqani safe house, was like, well, this is just the Haqqanis, so the Kandahari Taliban really wouldn't support this. Hey, folks, Yaqub's Kandahari Taliban. I hate to tell you. And if those two knew, you can be certain that the Taliban's emir, Mullah Habibatullah Akhundzada, knew that Zawahiri was there.
I got another D word for you, Bill, going through all this. Ready?
Go for it.
I got another D word for you. It's called dichotomy, as in false dichotomies. And how many false dichotomies were pitched during the course of this war, right? Because there you're talking about a false dichotomy between the Kandahari Taliban and the rest of the Taliban, and the Haqqanis and the rest of the Taliban. I mean, it just gets
they're Taliban, and look, I'm playing their game. Okay, I'll play your game. This is how it works. Let's break it down on your terms. You're still wrong, right? Not you, Tom. Them.
So I got it. I know you're.
Right. I'm going to give one more point, and then we'll move on from Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. I mean, it's God. We've written about this for decades, Tom. You and I. We've debunked the nonsense. Here's
yeah. And by the way, hopefully there is not some other act to the story that's bad, right? I mean, hopefully, they don't have the capacity to attack the U.S. anymore, and we can just kind of move on. I mean, that's what I'm hoping, but I can tell you this much: it isn't going to be based on any of these assessments. That's for sure.
Right? Hope is not a strategy, right? Here's what General Michael Kurilla, the commander U.S. Central Command, said in March about Al Qaeda, and as well, really about the ability to gather intelligence. In Afghanistan, the reduction in collection, analytical resources, and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets means our campaign against Al Qaeda and ISIS Khorasan is challenged. While we can see the broad contours of attack planning, we lack the granularity to see the complete threat picture. End quote. So keep in mind that the previous commander, General McKenzie, previous commander, said that our intelligence capacity was reduced from down to 1% to 2% of what it was while we were in Afghanistan after the withdrawal. He said that in December 2021. I highly doubt things have gotten better. And Tom, you and I have been highly critical of the intelligence capacity and
all I'd say about that is our intelligence wasn't all that great while we were there.
It wasn't, right, exactly. And what do we always go back to? We could go back to tons of instances, but the Shorabak raid, right? They're saying Al Qaeda is confined to the Northeast. This was DOD official reporting. Confined to the Northeast, 50 to 100 Al Qaeda. U.S. raid Shorabak, and they say that for 6 years straight. U.S. raid Shorabak in 2015, killed 150 or 200 Al Qaeda fighters there, and it's in Kandahar in the southeast. I mean, if that's what what 98% improvement of intelligence capacity gets you, boy, I'd hate to see it at 1% to 2%. And then I'd hate to see it 2 years later.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line from my perspective is there is a lot of uncertainty about
Of course.
state of Al Qaeda today, its leadership, all that stuff. I mean, I don't mind anybody saying that or saying there's a lot of, we don't even have an official public announcement of Zawahiri's successor, let alone have that person who's thought to be Saif al-Adil, communicating with the public in any way or rallying the cause. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty that invites. There's a lot, and probably deliberately, there's a lot of uncertainty that's going on here in terms of how Al Qaeda is structured at this point in 2024. You always have to be open to changing your assessments, right, based on
Absolutely.
the most current evidence and what that is. There's just not a whole lot of evidence at all, one way or the other, about what's going on right now, and that's kind of spooky. And we know that the assessments in the past all went in one direction. The various iterations of the D words, and they were always wrong. And that doesn't mean they're going to be wrong tomorrow, but there's no reason to buy that the same style of thinking, same style of doing assessments is automatically correct when they've been wrong so often. So that's my look. I don't know the full scope of what's going on at all. And I think there's a lot of, I'm repeating myself, but it's true. There's a lot of room for ambiguity here. There is a lot of ambiguity. But when we're looking backwards now, at the time, we know with certainty that these assessments were wrong. We said it at the time they were wrong, and they've been definitively debunked. So anybody pointing back to them going forward it's worse than a fool's errand.
Yeah, and it's difficult for me to trust those same people, the Khalilzads of the world, giving us those assessments, and that's really what it kind of boils down to, right? Why should I trust you when you've been so wrong in the past?
Yeah, well, I would say is whereas we don't really know the full scope of what's going on today, we know that guy doesn't know,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
I mean,
right.
like we may not know the full scope of what's going on, and there may be uncertainty, and we have a lot of different indications, and we have some evidence of what's going on, but we know he doesn't know.
Yeah, look, Al Qaeda's it's not just training camps, right? They a weapons storage facility in, in Panjshir of all places. If that isn't a message, the home of the National Resistance Front, madrasa. Like now, maybe this stuff won't be pointed at us, right? Maybe, but I know in the past it has been, and that's what I'm concerned about. Anyway, his dismissal of it is really galling, and this is what I want to get into the next part too, Tom. Khalilzad, he dismisses the monitoring team's report that we've referenced here about the training camps and madrasa, safe houses to get into Iran, et cetera, et cetera. And while doing so, he questions the nationality of at the time the chairman of the United Nations Security Council. And he's the individual who signed off on the monitoring report. He insinuates that.
I mean,
yeah, I'll read what he says. When asked about the monitoring report, I'm going to quote this, right? He says, "Yeah, it'd be good to see his nationality and where he's worked before and all the committee members that worked on it. So I'm not saying anything that I know as if this was not good or whatever, but I say I relied more on our own intelligence and our own people." Oops, back to that problem, right? With the last sentence. But his dismissal of the UN reports, which both you and I have covered in depth, and our friend Edmund Fitton Brown, who was the previous director of the monitoring team, we know the quality of his work, and we know members on that team. And they've even laid out to us here at Generation Jihad how they do their job, how they gather intelligence, how they do their own intelligence gathering as well as gathering it from member states, the analysis that they put in. I was really put off by that, Tom. Just your opinion.
Well, compare the UN monitoring group's reports in the lead up to the fall of Kabul to what Zalmay Khalilzad and others were selling the American people on, right? Let's go ahead and let's compare them. I mean, this is the way you do. This is the way everybody should be looking at analysis. There's a track record that can and should be measured. And those UN monitoring group reports were far more accurate in terms of the status of what the Taliban was doing, the status of the war, their gains at the expense of the Afghan government, and importantly, at their complete disinterest in peace with the Afghan government, their complete disinterest in forming some sort of unity government, which was another one of the fictions that Khalilzad was engaged in peddling. There was no absolutely zero interest from the Taliban in doing that. They just took over the country, which is what we said. So compare what the UN monitoring team. Nobody has a perfect score. Nobody gets 100 all the time, right? Everybody gets things wrong. There are certainly things that they've gotten wrong in the past that you and I known about and reported on. But in terms of assessing their analyses as compared to what Zalmay Khalilzad was relying on, I mean, I would bet on the UN monitoring team every day.
Yeah, and the head of the UN, I'm probably going to butcher his name. So, Dion Priyansah Johnny, he's Indonesian, FYI. So you know those Indonesians with an axe to grind out there, yeah, whatever.
Again, I have no idea what the hell he was even close. I was even trying to argue there. Like I don't even know.
Well, I
Yeah, I mean, some
yeah,
sort of imputing some sort of motive based on nationality or whatever when it comes to this stuff. I mean, that's
maybe he thought he was an Indian or something like that.
I don't know.
That's the only thing. Maybe he knew the name and he thought that was an Indian name. I don't know. We can only guess. But I would say an Indonesian who's very likely Muslim. The fact that he's signing off on a report like this, yeah, a big check mark against you, Zalmay. Probably shouldn't have made that argument. But next, Tom, I think we kind of touched on this. His reliance on the process and the agreements. He says this multiple times. Well, they said they would agree to this, and the Taliban signed the agreement, and the Pakistanis said they supported peace. Well, I'm going to take just a quick second on the Pakistanis and his, I've told this story here at Generation Jihad before, but I'll tell it again. In 2000, I think it was July 2016, I testified alongside Zalmay Khalilzad in a I can't remember what the committee it was, but it was House Foreign Affairs Committee subcommittee, and it was on the subject was Pakistan, friend or foe in the war on terror. Khalilzad made the argument that the Taliban would never break from Al Qaeda. Whoops! Today he's saying they he implies, by the way, that who would have dismantled Al Qaeda anyway? It would, of course, have been the Taliban. He implies that by when he says Al Qaeda has been dismantled. Well, dismantled by who? Who else would it be? Anyway,
maybe he means they dismantled Zawahiri's safe house after he killed there in El Kabul because they had to build a new Al Qaeda safe house. I mean that's what he means by dismantled. I don't know.
It's possible, right? So he testifies.
Those drones do a lot of damage. Although that was pretty specific. I mean, it only got Zawahiri and kind of just the patio there. So
it was one of those ninja flechette drones where it basically puts those blades out. So maybe it wasn't as destructive as we thought. Who knows what the remnants of the missile does? But I wanted pictures of that. But oh well, maybe I got issues and I should see someone, some different kind of therapy. But yeah, so I testified alongside him. He said that Taliban and Al Qaeda, that relationship would remain unbroken. It's strong. That Pakistan was supporting the Taliban and it would always support the Taliban for strategic death. And Tom, you've testified as well, right? You write your written testimony, then you write up your 5-minute verbal testimony, right? Which it's prepared. In his verbal testimony, that's what Khalilzad said, and I'm literally sitting there going, "Fuck, what do I say here? I'm just going to repeat what this guy just said." So I called an audible and said, Khalilzad is correct, and let me give you some examples.
Well, there's no reason. We should just have said, just in case this guy ever takes a job as a diplomat where he goes back on any of this, I just want to leave a big mark on the record here, to say, no, he really just said the following, and he can't, no backseats. Okay, but go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Right, Tom? If I only had a crystal ball. Yeah, I've testified probably like 7, 8, 9 times. I've never been in that position. Tom, it was almost like he stole my notes, right? And just said it in his way. And so, I wasn't going to waste the committee's time by being repetitive. So I just gave examples. Within 2 years of that, he took over, I think in August or September 2018, he tells us the Taliban's going to break with Al Qaeda, that the relationship isn't important, and that Pakistan is a supporter of peace. Never explains this, right? This is what really bothers me. Well, again, a lot of things bother me about Khalilzad, but And by the way, another thing that really bothered me about this testimony, he refers to himself as Zal throughout the testimony. It's really
Yeah,
odd. Did you
we
catch
got.
that?
Somebody was criticizing on social media for referring to him as Zal, and I was like, well, wait a minute, that's his shtick, right? He refers to himself as Zal, so
It is, right? But
right,
it's just
yeah.
it's
I've been
really
using his
is.
last name here because I'm trying to be somewhat respectful, but he does refer to himself as Zal all the time. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, his reliance, it gets back to what you said at the beginning. The only goal was we're leaving and the rest of this is window dressing. And really, what I wanted someone to ask him, either in his public testimony or in this testimony, was, did you really believe that the Taliban broke with Al Qaeda? Did you really believe that Pakistan, which entire strategy is predicated on strategic depth, and it was going to gain that by supporting the Taliban, that Pakistan wanted the Taliban to share
it's all in the
power
classified
with an
annex.
Afghan government?
Bill, it's all in the classified annex.
Yeah, right.
Magical box. I mean, he could go on Penn and Teller, and he could fool everybody, right? He go, I got this classified annex here. I'm gonna make everything disappear in this box, right? Including everything I've said previously about these issues. Whoopsie, there you go. It's all disappeared now. But
Yeah,
I don't think
it's
Penn and Teller will go for that one though. I think they just
no, I don't. Yeah, it was just you just heard him like he sticks to process. He sticks to, well, our goal is to get an agreement. We get them to sign the agreement. We're good. And nothing mattered to him other than getting that agreement. And for someone who claims he cares about Afghans and who claims to be a warrior diplomat, that was another thing that was, he refers to himself as a
yeah,
warrior
I saw that.
diplomat multiple times in his testimony. Um,
Yeah, that was definitely deserving of some mocking.
a warrior diplomat for who? After this outcome, yeah, Tom. Again, I know we touched up, and when you put it in the context that really all he cared about was getting that agreement, that nothing mattered, it's no surprise that he's going to whitewash the Taliban relationship with Al Qaeda, whitewash the Taliban's desire to agree, stick to process on paper, hide behind the classified annex, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean that's where the fault really begins for me, right? I mean, I understand that the president of the United States is ultimately the decision maker, and that you're operating under the terms of what that the president has decided, and the decision was to get out. But that doesn't mean you have to sell people on all the rest of this nonsense, and either because you believe it yourself, in which case it says something about your judgment that is not good, right? Or you're being dishonest, which is also obviously not good. But I mean, definitely different times in the transcript where it seemed to me that he was, even as you know Rome was burning, he was kind of fiddling away on this whole idea that there was going to be negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And even at the point where the Taliban has surrounded Kabul and they're like, okay, we're going to take it over now. I mean, he was asked at one point in the transcript, about his role in assisting the special immigrant visas, right? For the Afghans who hold the SIVs that were left behind. And he says he had a negligible role. And he says the reason for that is because as the situation on the ground changed, he was working on other elements of the negotiations to get the government together based on an agreement between the Taliban, the Talibs, and the government, principally. And I'm just thinking to myself, what in the heck are you talking about? Really, you really thought, the Taliban was going to agree? They're taking over the country. Kabul is surrounded, and you think that this is still a possibility, right? That somehow they're going to share power with anybody? I mean, it's total nonsense. I mean, I know I use the word nonsense over and over again because I don't know. That's like the most respectful way I can put it, because it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, Tom, and this, I had this written down as notes about this. And at that time, I dismissed it, right? And basically, what I have here is basically says it's hard to tell whether he believes what he's doing or he's just following a process to go ahead and get what he wants is with that withdrawal. But when you talk about that, right, fiddling while Kabul is burning, right, trying to get an agreement between, did he really believe that? Like, if at that point he really believed that, at like what point do you start drinking your own Kool-Aid? Is that what happened here, or is he lying to us? This is what's so compelling about reading this. And obviously, you have to be Afghanistan geeks like Tom and I, and in order to read all 284 pages of this testimony. But this, you walk away from this, and at times I'm going, "Oh, Zal knew exactly what he's doing. He laid it out in the beginning. He was just getting a deal." And then there's times like you mentioned where he's doing that. Why? Did he really believe this? Does he, or did he understand? Was he just going through the motions so that he could say that he tried this? And that's what I just having a really difficult time wrapping my head around this. Do you think I'm off base here?
No, but my point, and I think I said this earlier too, that like if whether he believes it or he's being dishonest, right? Whatever the explanation is, it's a bad one, right? Whatever the reason is, right? Because it means either you're completely clueless and got it wrong, or you're being dishonest. So either way, it doesn't lead to a path where anybody should trust you on any of this stuff. And it's certainly when you're taking shots at Long War Journal or taking shots at the UN monitoring team. Excuse me, buddy. Your track record here is zero. You got nothing right. And we did a heck of a lot better than that. So maybe be a little bit humble and just say, I was totally wrong about all this, and just exit stage left, as opposed to pretending like, he still has something to say.
Yeah,
or worrying about his legacy as compared to Henry Kissinger according to Politico, which I was like, okay, right?
right.
I mean,
I
unless
go
you're
back to that, Tom.
Cambodia, I guess, unless he's trying to come back for a bombing of Cambodia campaign or something. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what that.
Well, maybe he's going to insert himself in the Israel Hamas dispute. Who knows? We got Doha in the middle.
There was that report he wanted to get involved in Ukraine. Remember?
There was, yes. I mean, what could possibly go wrong, Tom? His analysis and knowledge was so good.
Well, he's already thrown one U.S. partner government under the bus, so
yeah, just line him up. Yeah, and watching him comment on Twitter on foreign policy, but by the way, it's his right. But again, just a failure to admit his failures in this, which are clear.
And again, this isn't personal for me at all. I don't even know the guy, right? I just know I just know what he's arguing and what he said, and we called in real time that it was all nonsense and wrong, and obviously not truthful. But you can read the transcript, and he's talking about these other people involved in the process who they have similar track records at this point in time. He's talking about how intelligent they are and how great they are. And I'm not going to go down the names.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not here to do that, but I know I've testified along some of these people too, and I'm like, nah, these people do not not the brightest bulbs in the lot, and all this stuff, and we're also pitching the same nonsense that he was pitching. So this speaks to a broader problem, I would say, which is this accountability for people who are in these government positions, where you can either, the charitable explanation is you got it totally wrong, and there really is no accountability. There really is nobody to say at the end of the day, hey, let's go through why you got this wrong and make sure it doesn't happen again at a minimum. On that note, there's only one other thing I was going to say from the transcript, Bill, and then maybe we can wrap it up. But here's one other thing I noticed. He talked about how the general before General Scotty Miller was very proud about this temporary ceasefire. Do you remember this?
Oh, yes.
And he says this general took a lot of pride and satisfaction from it because apparently he'd helped negotiate it. And this was a very short-lived ceasefire for attacks against U.S. forces. And I think he's talking about General Nicholson.
It's right? General Nicholson, yes.
Right,
he would be before Miller.
I think it's the time I had from before Miller, right? And you and I looked at that. We remember at the time there was spin out of military analyst circles saying this is a unique opportunity for peace. This shows that there really is, the Taliban really do want to stop. And we were looking at thinking, no, this is just for their own religious reasons they did this. And it's not even a fig leaf. It's an obvious ploy to get people to think that they're really not, they're going to stop fighting and not take over the country, when of course they are going to keep fighting and take over the country. And it just told me again, this is why it's not totally about Khalilzad at all. Obviously, you see in this transcript even, and I don't have any reason to think he's being dishonest in this score, right? I mean, this is the type of thing that we know the military circles were pushing at the time. So, in other words, there needs to be a lot more holding people's feet to the fire for accountability here across the board. Not just this guy,
Yeah, absolutely. And, I also think that Taliban in that instance was demonstrating that it can control all of its forces. If I recall, if it was that certain ceasefire, and the Taliban claims it was unilateral too. They said they did not do this in negotiation. U.S. officials are claiming otherwise. I'd be really curious to see if that's true. It doesn't really matter. We know what the reasons were.
Either way, it did not indicate anything in terms of their desire to take over the country, right? Just as it did not indicate anything about whether or not they had a military solution or not, because they did have a military solution.
Yeah, we know. Yeah. Tom, I'm going to touch on really two quick points, and there really doesn't need to be a ton of discussion about it. There were two other things that Khalilzad. Well, actually, I'll just focus on. We'll make this the last one. It's interesting. Khalilzad in there, he admits that President Biden, one of the alternatives for the Biden administration was to discard the Doha Agreement. He says in there, and I don't have the quote, but he basically says there's three things. The U.S. could have just picked up and left, which was basically what you and I proposed doing. If you
a couple years earlier, if that was the right decision made, yeah,
right, and that would have been smart under the Trump administration again, because the Taliban was not as strong then as it was in 2020, 21, nor was it granted that strength. That Biden could have discarded the deal and just either fought the Taliban or come to some whatever, or he followed through. And he says the decision was made to follow through. And I thought that was interesting only because President Biden and others and said we were handcuffed. We could not discard this. This would have meant, and he gets into that. Well, if we discarded the deal, that meant that there would have been attacks on U.S. troops, but maybe not. I mean, how do we really know that? And I thought that was kind of interesting that he came out and mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the obvious point here, that and part of the reason why President Biden owns the final act, right? As much as we were critical of the Trump years and the herky-jerky policymaking there and decision, Khalilzad also gets into how in 2017 there was a national security strategy under General H.R. McMaster that was all about trying to turn the tide of the war and actually give a path to victory, and how that was just over a year later completely abandoned, total whiplash, and we just got to get out, right? So these types of decisions set the context for everything that people were doing here in terms of military and diplomatic leadership. And then President Biden comes along, and he could have easily, he dumped other agreements the Trump administration forged. He could have gotten out of this one, and it was obvious that despite what Khalilzad would have people believe, it was obvious that the Taliban was not keeping up any of its supposed counterterrorism assurances, and it didn't have any interest in talking to the Afghan government. So there were many different reasons to say we're going to form a different path forward here. I mean, you could still, even at that point, you could have still left and negotiated with the Afghan government, a strategy for leaving, where you provided support via contractors, other supports to let them actually fight on their own. Probably still would have lost, or maybe still would have lost, but it would have been more in charge as opposed to being completely servile and deferential to the Taliban, which is what this all led America into, and that's why this is all so disgraceful.
Yeah, you reminded me something. Khalilzad's asked about, well, did the Taliban adhere to the deal? And he's like, first he says, well, there wasn't any attacks. And then he says, oh, well, there wasn't any attacks that resulted in the death of American soldiers. I thought that was really interesting. And where have we seen this recently? With attacks on U.S. bases where the Biden administration, in Iraq and Syria, by Shia militias, where they essentially ignored these attacks until 3 U.S. troops were killed in an attack in Jordan. And if that's the mentality that's driving, it's no reason that we lose these wars.
On that cheery note,
Tom, always a pleasure, my friend. I'm really glad we got to get on and talk about this, and let's talk again soon.
Thanks, Bill, for having me. It's always great coming back on the podcast, and feels like coming home.
It really does. I'm sitting here, I'm smiling. I'm going to be on my tippy toes all days because Tom and I got to reunite for a podcast.
And let's go Rangers.
Says you. Well, for all my New York friends, let's go Rangers. My Flyers are long out of it. Never made it. So sure. Why not? As I choke on my tongue saying that. Tom, thanks again for joining us. And thanks everyone for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you could follow us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again. We'll see you all again real soon.